Good morning. Mr. McIntosh.
Today's witness is Dr. Teresa Inkster, and also tomorrow as well.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Inkster.
Morning.
Now, as you understand, you're going to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh, who's sitting opposite you. But first, I understand you're prepared to affirm.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Dr. Inkster. Now, you're scheduled for all of today and tomorrow. We sit between 10 and 1 in the morning, between 10 and 1 in the morning, but we usually take a break at about 11:30 for coffee. However, should you wish to take a break at any other time, please feel free just to give me an indication and we'll simply take a break. I'm very conscious of this because I'm rather hard of hearing. Perhaps if you could, in answering questions, speak maybe just a little louder than you would in conversation. You've got the microphones there, which should assist, but maybe just a little louder, maybe a little slower than you would in normal conversation. I would certainly value that, and got to bear in mind that everyone in the room has to hear. No, Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you. Can I start with taking your full name?
Teresa Jane Inkster.
And what's your current occupation?
I'm currently a consultant microbiologist and infection control doctor with our High Scotland.
And that's part of NSS Scotland?
Yes.
Did you produce a 390-page statement for the inquiry?
I did.
Are you willing to adopt it as a statement, or any small changes you want to make?
I have two small changes. It's okay.
Could you do it by the paragraph references?
So the first one is paragraph 146.
So what we'll do for the assistance of the participants present in the room is put page 55 on the screen, if we could. So what's the change of paragraph 146 you need to make?
So the first line, pre-2015, should just read 2015.
Thank you. And what's the other changes you want to make?
The other one is paragraph 884.
So that is on page 280. If we could put that on the screen, please. And what change do you want to make to this paragraph?
The date should be on the 16th of August.
Thank you. Is there any other changes you need to make?
No.
No. If we can take that off the screen, are you willing to adopt your statement as part of your evidence today and tomorrow? Now, clearly, you've produced a very long statement with lots of information in it, and I'm not proposing to simply walk through it. What I want to do is pick up issues over the next 2 days, and perhaps for your assistance and those of my colleagues present, I'm planning to do this in chronological order or something close to it. And in essence, what I plan to do, with a bit of luck, is to deal with the events up until the autumn of 2018 today, and deal with events after then tomorrow. But clearly, we will take the time we need to take. What is your current? You explained your current role already. Now, at the very beginning of your statement, I won't take you to it. You explained that when you became a consultant microbiologist in 2009, you sought out a role that involved infection prevention control. And the implication being that some microbiologists don't do that. We've heard evidence that in NHS Greater Glasgow, some microbiologists had some sessions as ICDs. How should the microbiologist who's not got sessions of ICDs raise infection control issues they come across in their practice as a microbiologist?
So there are various ways that they might do that. So, for example, in our department in the Queen Elizabeth, we would have a morning handover meeting. So these other microbiologists are providing the on-call cover overnight, so they are covering infection control. So they would hand over any relevant issues to the team that morning, which would include the infection control doctor for
So
the
if something
site.
arose overnight or over a weekend,
Yes,
that's the handover
that
there.
would be the handover.
What if it arose out of, they've been asked to analyse a sample from a patient, they fed back the results to the clinicians, but they have an infection control concern at that point? How should they take that forward?
So normally they would communicate that with the infection control team, and by that might mean myself as the lead ICD or the sector ICD, but they would generally copy in the infection control nurses, depending on the severity of the situation. They might also at that point copy in the infection control manager and the associate nurse director for infection control. So there would be what we would call a mailing list for each site, and everyone would be familiar of who to contact depending on which hospital that they were working in.
Are there any circumstances when a microbiologist who's not got infection control sessions would do more than simply email it in to the infection control team?
I suppose it depends on the gravity of the situation, and outbreaks and incidents can happen at any time and they're very unpredictable. So you could be faced with a situation over a weekend that requires escalation at that point in time, which might require more extensive emailing, including senior management, or sometimes the creation of a document that we call an SBAR, a situation, background assessment and recommendation document. It would depend on the severity of the situation.
Annette, there seem to be lots of different sorts of SBARs that we've come across in this inquiry, and you describe one of them, which is created by a microbiologist. Are SBARs created by other doctors in this field as well, and other members of staff?
I'm not really sure out with microbiology and infection control. When I started, it was I was informed that that was the way that the medical director liked to receive information. It's quite a clear and concise document. The way that it's laid out is quite brief. So I would imagine that other doctors may in fact have used that same form of communication to senior management, but I can't be absolutely sure of that.
Right. Well, we'll probably come across these issues as we go along. What I'd like to do, however, is to take you to page 13 of your statement, paragraph 13, where you just discuss your own role as a consultant microbiologist in the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Paragraph 13, so it would be page 15. You discuss at the bottom of the page, you discuss your own role in the middle of the page at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. See paragraph 12?
Yes.
Now, what I wanted to ask you is what connection you had before the early months of 2015 with the Southern General Hospital.
So I wasn't based there. I was based in the north, but I quite early on raised concerns about isolation rooms, which are known as the PPVL rooms.
Did they have some in the Southern General?
Not at that time, but I was working in the north closely with Dr. John Hood, who was the expert in ventilation internally at the time, and I remember him showing me the plans.
Well,
for
no,
the Southern
it wasn't
General.
about the new. We'll come to that. It
Okay.
wasn't about the plans for the new hospital. I wonder what connection you had with the old Southern General Hospital.
Minimal. I went there as a trainee 1 day a week to just provide additional cover because they were short-staffed. I think it was on a Monday. So I would go there, I would be laboratory-based for that day, and I would do a ward round to the neurosurgical unit, which is the old retained estate. But that was my only input there up until I moved there.
We've got in the practice of asking anybody who has any connection the same question, which is, were you aware, even in that limited time you had connection with the Southern General, of any way that microbiologists or infection control teams in that hospital had any cause to consider any suspected link between infections in the Southern General and the Shield Hall waste treatment plant?
No, I don't recall that being discussed.
Thank you. Now, if we think of the period prior to your appointment as a regional sector ICD, and I will deal with the period after that later, what was your perspective, in broad terms, of the institutional culture within the IPC team of NHS Greater Glasgow at that time?
So initially, as I've detailed, I worked mainly at the Golden Jubilee Hospital, but I had 1 day a week where I covered the Western before I moved across the city to Glasgow Royal, and I covered 5 sessions a week. At that time, I felt I had very good relationships with the infection control nursing teams on both sites. I felt that NHS GGC infection control team at that time was very good at what we call mandatory reporting, mandatory surveillance, adhering to the national manual, anything that had guidance around it. They were very good at collecting and presenting data, SPC charts. Where I think they were perhaps, I think they were unfamiliar how to approach new threats. So something that was new and different and hadn't been described in guidance. I felt there was an approach where things might often be downplayed, that they might look for other reasons as to why these infections were happening, that they weren't particularly open to new knowledge at the time from, the literature or discussions I'd had at meetings. So I found, and I've described a couple of incidents where I found it quite difficult to convince the SMT that there was a problem. And during a couple of those incidents, they withdrew support. So I was attending incident management teams with the local infection control nursing team who were very supportive. And I had support from the clinician and a microbiology colleague of mine, a previous ICD, Professor John Coya. And we were sort of left to manage these incidents ourselves. And at one point, I remember being asked to communicate to the medical director about one, which would be very unusual for me at my level. But it was like the rest of the team were taking a step back.
So that's obviously not a period when we're looking at what happened. But what I will come back to at the end of your evidence is a series of questions about the consequences of what you've said in the whole evidence. And one of the questions I want to ask you then, so you might want to think about it, is the extent to which the culture that we will go on to discuss impacts on the questions that the inquiry is focused on. So what I want to do is just focus about your experience and a particular issue around new builds, ventilation and water. Now, you've discussed your expertise in some detail in your statement in paragraphs 28 to 48 and 70 to 79. And I'm not going to take you to them because you've discussed it in some length. But I need you to ask you a slightly invidious question about the time prior to you becoming lead ICD, and about who in the world of NHS GGC had a particular skill set. It might have included you, it might not, it might include other people, and I'm keen to work out who's available, as it were, to look at things. So among the clinicians and the estates managers employed by the board in 2009, now if you can't answer this question, do say so. Who do you think had the expertise to advise the board on the specification of new water or ventilation systems for a hospital?
I would say at that time the person would be Dr. John Hood, and also to a certain extent Dr. Penelope Redding, but John Hood was recognised as the consultant with expertise in both. He was the go-to person, even though he wasn't a designated infection control doctor.
If we then step forward to 2014, to the year before the hospital opens, who then would have been the clinicians and estates managers in the hospital who had the expertise to give such advice?
So again, Dr. Hood, but I think by that time also myself and Dr. Christine Peters, because although we were in different hospitals at the time, we had built up quite a lot of experience in built environment issues. My experience was mainly in refurbishments, which is not the same as a new build, but I had developed considerable expertise, particularly in relation to ventilation, because I covered a surgical hospital, so operating theatres, I became very familiar with those. But I also covered the Beatson, so I was familiar with the neutropenic rooms, and also the Brownlee Centre, which had negative pressure rooms for infectious diseases. And Christine Peters brought expertise from her time in Cross House. So I would say at that time there were 3 of us, I feel, available that could provide that expertise.
And is there any particular reason you haven't identified any estates personnel who have expertise in this area?
Mainly because I didn't really know them. I think the one person who did was Mr. Powrie. I'd worked with him in Glasgow Royal, and I would say particularly in relation to water, but also to a degree in ventilation. So I would say that he was someone that I was familiar with at the time.
Right. Yeah. Looking at the procurement of the new hospital, from the point of view from the period where they set the clinical output specifications so that's before the tender is issued, up through to handover, what should have been the role of the infection prevention control team in that process of specifying and building the new hospital from your point of view?
They should have been involved from the very beginning, from the absolute beginning, the planning stages, all the way through the design, the installation, the commissioning, and then maintenance. That's what I would have expected to happen, because at the time there was a chief executive letter, I think that was 2007. The role was very clear in that. There was the associated SHFN 30, the HAI scribe document. And the process that was in place in North Glasgow, where I was working, was indeed that for refurbs. I was involved all the way through the process. I would sign the plans, I would meet with architects, the clinical teams, very involved, do walk rounds of the area. So it was a surprise to me to find the issues in the Queen Elizabeth, because it seemed to me that culture, if you like, around new builds was embedded within GGC at the time. There was good practice.
There's been two alternative perspectives offered on this, one of which would probably be summarised that a sufficient involvement was provided by the secondment of an infection control nurse, initially in the form of Annette Rankin and then Jackie Stewart. And the second perspective that seems to be come across is that there is something within some parts of HI scribe documentation, SHFN 30, that implies that the primary focus of the role of ensuring compliance is for the project team. Now, how would you react to probably those two together, because they seem to be, in essence, the response to what you've just said?
Well, I think infection control is all about team working, and the infection control nurses have a certain skill set, but as do the infection control doctors. And we've heard from many witnesses that, and I've heard this myself in GGC, that nurses did not do ventilation and water. So that's obviously a big concern when you have a new build project. The impression that I was given is that their role was more about, fixtures and fittings and general layouts, that sort of advice. So there seemed to be a big gap with very important things, in that there wasn't any medical leadership there, because, at that time, Dr. Hood was the go-to person, and he was dealing with all the water and ventilation issues across the city. So why not have someone involved? And I feel that an infection control doctor, at least one, possibly even more, should have been seconded. So complete removal from their day job and just given that as a task. It's such a complex building with some very complex units that I think having expert opinion as well as just a infection control doctor involved in that. So as we've done in the past, consult with Peter Hoffman. Dr. Andrew Striefel in the States was responsible for, supporting John Hood with the beats in. So that's the sort of model I would have expected. So leadership from nurses, leadership from doctors, but also consultation with external experts.
Thank you. I want to move on to your role at handover and the sense of what you discovered in 2015. I wonder if we can go to page 34 of the statement bundle, paragraph 84 and 85. Now, you're discussing here that you didn't attend, or your non-attendance at AICCs, then the fact that you attended and you were told to attend but not to speak. Now, and then you discuss the SMT meetings. Now, this may be my fault, but my impression gained from looking at the minutes of the AICC and the IPC senior management team is they don't seem to contain a lot of content about the various incidents this inquiry is investigating. They do seem to contain a lot of generalized, standardized reporting and systems. And to what extent do you think the AICC, and I suppose also the BICC, and the whole system was effective in supervising the risk from unusual organisms that may have arisen from the water ventilation system in the new hospital?
I don't think it was particularly effective. It felt to me that AICC was a tick box exercise. We had an agenda, there was a lot of reporting, but not enough reporting about serious issues on the site or outbreaks. We were discouraged to speak up. When I first started, I was told that's how it was. You go there, you say very little, you leave it to the lead ICD to talk to things. It felt like a very controlled meeting, the AICC.
Thank you. I want you to take that off the screen. I want to now move on to the information you were given about the services that you were covering as regional ICD. Now, if I understand it correctly, that's primarily the adult bone marrow treatment service. Now, is that just 4B or does it extend to 4C as well?
It was just 4B at the time. I think there was a bit of discussion as to whether I covered 4C, but it was 4B at the time.
Well, I like to look at a bundle document, which is bundle 14 of volume 1, page 170. Now, this appears to be a discussion in August 14. And if we go back to the beginning of it, because I think it'll make more sense, at the start of, on page 193, we appear to have an email from Mr. Parry. And then if we go to the next page 192, it's forwarded on to the SMT. We go to page 191. We have a link about CDC guidance here from you. Now, what I wondered is, why are you sending details of CDC guidance to David Loudon and Peter Moyer, copying in the ICM manager and the lead ICD in February 2015?
So I was asked to attend this meeting. I had been raising concerns about the isolation rooms, the PPVL rooms with Peter Hoffman. They were a design that I was unfamiliar with. So I'd forwarded that to Professor Williams. So I was involved with the isolation rooms, but also at the time I was covering the bone marrow transplant unit on the Gartnavel site in the Beatson. And it was explained to me that they were creating 2 rooms for bone marrow transplant patients within the renal ward.
In the new hospital?
Yes, and the reason for that was that the Western Infirmary was closing. So normally patients from the Beatson would go across to the Western Infirmary for dialysis because some patients with haematological disorders do require dialysis. So the Western was being closed down, so they would have to go to the south for dialysis.
That's where the Western Renal Service was going to?
Yes, so there were 2 rooms for bone marrow transplant patients designated in, I'm sorry, I think it's either 4A or 4D, but they weren't the same rooms that we had at the Beatson, they were lobbied rooms. So that was why I was involved.
So can you explain for the benefit of us, what's the difference between the rooms in the Beatson and the rooms that are being talked about in this context in February 2015?
So the rooms in the Beatson were sort of traditional positive pressure rooms. So it was just a room at positive pressure, usually.
So that means the air is at a higher pressure in the room, so it's especially pushing outwards.
Yes, so the air's coming out the way. They were HEPA filtered, they had a higher change rate. These were a different style of room. These were the PPVL rooms. So the room itself is at a neutral pressure, and it's the lobby that's at the positive pressure. And I was conscious that Peter Hoffman had concerns about the neutral pressure of the room. His view was that it's never really neutral, it's either positive or negative. So either way you will get leakage in one direction or the other, and that could potentially put immunosuppressed patients at risk.
So the concern would be that if you had a PPVL room where the room itself wasn't properly sealed, then air could get into the room,
yes,
even though the lobby is preventing the door from
yes,
providing the air.
So that was his concern. So part of the reason, well, there were a few reasons for sending CDC guidance. CDC guidance is much more descriptive than the SHTM.
No, when you say CDC, that's the United States Center for Disease Control.
Yes. They had an environmental guidance document at the time, quite comprehensive, and a lot of detail on what they call protective environment rooms for immunosuppressed patients. And it went beyond just the basic specification. It also gives you different schematics as to how you can utilise a lobby. So there are 2 things you can do with the lobby. You can have it at a positive pressure, and the room at a positive pressure, and that's what we would call a positive pressure cascade, which means the lobby is at 10 pascals and the room is at 20 pascals. And that's giving the patient an extra layer of protection.
So the air is effectively moving from the patient's room out through the lobby to the corridor?
Yeah. The other thing that you can do with a lobbied room is that you can have the patient room at a positive pressure and the lobby at a negative pressure. And the benefit of that is that you can have an immunosuppressed individual protected in the room, but if they have an airborne infection, for example, chickenpox or tuberculosis, you're protecting other patients. So that CDC guidance was much more descriptive as how you could utilise a lobby in a different way than the PPVL concept.
So at this point, this is February 15, so this is after the hospital has been handed over to the health board. Were you aware of that at the time?
No.
What would have had to happen to change these rooms that were being talked about in this conversation? These two rooms in 4C, 4A, 4D, all the rooms in 4B to the CDC specifications. What would have had to take place in order to do that?
Well, patients should have been moved across for a start, so there would have to be shouldn't be moved across, so there would have had to be a delay in moving patients across. But this would be for both fairly significant refurbishment. So it would require experts to come in and actually develop proposals as to what the ventilation spec is going to be and how they're now going to do that on a retrospective basis. So there's all sorts of implications possibly in terms of air handling units, ductwork, degrees of HEPA filtration. So I think what I'm saying is it would not be straightforward. It would cause significant delay.
How was your provision of this guidance note received?
I didn't get a response, which is why I had to send it again. I think I sent it twice. Maybe it was before the February meeting, but I recall having to send it twice because I didn't feel that people were listening to me at the time.
Now, if we can turn now to the topic of the Horn Optitherm taps and your awareness of those. You cover them in at page 43 of your statement. Page 112. Now, what I want to do is just to put something to you, because you're discussing the need to remove flow straighteners. In essence, that's the point you're making. Now, if you nod, the poor person do the transcript doesn't get very far. So yes. Were you aware at this point, i.e., early in 2015, of the 7th of March 2014 meeting? Sorry, the 5th of June 2014 meeting between NSS and GGC people, and indeed the Horn Company and external experts about these taps?
So I knew a meeting was to take place because I was working in HPS at the time and there was difficulty with availability, and by the time the meeting took place I had left the role, so I knew a meeting was scheduled. I did not see minutes of the meeting until actually I think it was the 2018 incident when Sandra Devine forwarded them to me. I was aware from water technical groups that there had been a decision that the taps would remain and that there was to be a risk assessment around those taps, and options at that time were to attempt to remove some of the flow straighteners in high risk units, or consideration be given to water testing. But there was an agreement, I think, that at that point that the taps would remain.
Well, if we look at the minute, which is a bundle 15 at page 692, and we look first at the people present, Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Parry and Mr. McFadden from the Health Board. If we go on to the next page, the page after we get to the end of the minutes, there we are. We have an action point at 5.3. So given that what's the conclusion of this minute is that the flow straighteners, the taps are to remain, and there's no need to remove flow straighteners, but that any residual perceived or potential risk would form part of routine management processes, should you have actually received this at the time you were appointed lead ICD, if not earlier? Or at least been told what was to happen?
I should have been told what was to happen. I did attend board water safety groups where it was discussed and there was a risk assessment put in place. there was discussion about whether we could remove the flow straighteners, but I recall Ian Powrie saying that wasn't possible, so it was considered at some point. I remember raising concerns about it because I'd been involved with the SPAR and HPS, and I asked that we start testing the water.
So when's this?
Oh, this would have been towards the end of 2015 into 2016. I recall meeting with Mr. Powrie to discuss, and it will be in the Board Water Safety Group minutes. Because my concern was that the flow straighteners were still there, and that if we couldn't remove them, then we would need to embark on regular water testing. I faced resistance initially with that because at the time, Health Protection Scotland had released the National Pseudomonas Guidance, and it did not recommend water testing. It was different from the guidance in NHS England Wales at the time.
So this is just, if we can catch in there before we go too far.
Mm-hmm.
There was the instance in Northern Ireland
Yes.
and Western Australia, which prompted a letter
Mm-hmm.
widely circulated in Scotland. There's the meeting in June 14.
Yeah.
There's the SBAR from HPS, which you were involved in. And would it be fair to say that at the end of that process, there is a decision or a conclusion out of this meeting that the taps don't need to be removed?
Yes.
Yes. There's also a conclusion that the flow straighteners don't need to be removed. What do you now understand to have been the thing that should have been done? If we don't remove the taps and don't remove flow straighteners, what's effectively the decision in 2015 of what should be done?
I mean, my preference would have been to remove the
No,
taps,
it wasn't
but
about your opinion. It's what
okay,
you
so
think
what should have been done.
What you think that the
Water
process.
testing.
What,
Water testing should have been implemented.
what
at
about
that
cleaning
stage.
or maintenance of the taps?
Oh yes, absolutely. But that should be happening regardless, and that's standard.
When, as far as you're aware, was there a program of regular maintenance to these taps designed to address this risk started?
I think I recall maintenance being discussed at the Board Water Safety Group meeting, but just because something is discussed doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening.
But we've heard some evidence that to clean these taps is quite a convoluted process. So I'm wondering when you would have noticed that happening actually in the wards of high-risk patients.
I never noticed it happening in the wards of high-risk patients until 2018.
Okay. Now, so what were, as far as you understand, the routine management processes that did take place in 15, 16, 17 about these taps?
I don't know what that refers to. I would assume that that would mean water testing and, as you've said, maintenance of the taps.
But did that happen?
In addition to that, there would be flushing would be really important as well, and just ongoing identification of what we would call little used outlets, process for that, removal of dead legs, all that sort of thing.
So it's a combination of all four of those things?
Combination of many things, not just tap maintenance and water testing.
Okay. We can go back to your statement, please, to page 47. And paragraph 122. So you're discussing in this section observations about the function of the IMT, but it's the final sentence. And the context here is, I think, early in your appointment, I have mentioned that there was no exceptional reporting process in place in the hospital whereby ICDs would be routinely made aware of specification results. Now, firstly, are you talking about before you became the ICD at this point?
Yes.
Right. We've heard some evidence that there was a process where out of specification results were sent to the lead ICD. Are you able to comment on whether that was actually happening?
That happened later because I had to initiate it.
So there's some suggestion that Professor Williams would have received out of specification results. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that because I recall emails between myself and I think Mr. Powrie and other people about the process around Legionella testing results. And it was clear to me that there was not the same process that we'd had in Glasgow Royal, which was this exception reporting. And I recall meeting with him to actually set that up. And I remember seeing gaps in that. In particular, the paediatric bone marrow transplant unit was not included on the list for sampling. So I recall all of that. So I'm not aware of the processes by which Professor Williams would have received the results. But by the time I came along as lead ICD, I had the same process in place that I'd had in Glasgow Royal Infirmary.
When did you create with Mr. Parry this process? What's the date of this review?
I think that was around December, triggered by...
December which year?
December 2015, triggered by the cancellation of a meeting. So myself and Dr. Peters had been raising concerns about not having seen water results, and there was no process. And we'd arranged a meeting to go through all these results, and it was cancelled. So we didn't see the results, but I followed it up with Mr. Powrie and asked him if we could put this exception reporting process in place. I certainly met with him at the beginning of February, because details of that meeting are in the board water safety group from around that time. And I discussed aspects of that meeting at a senior management team also, I think, in February 2016.
Now, would this be the document, the sort of first version of the out of specification reporting list that appears in the water safety plan for the site now? I was going to come to this later on in your evidence, but I might just pick it up now, but I'm just desperately looking for the reference. But do you remember, are you aware there's now a water safety plan for the whole site? And have you seen that recently or before you left?
I hadn't seen it before I left. I've seen it in the bundles.
So if you just give me a second, I'll find it. Well, we'll come back to that when I had it in my notes, because I think otherwise it'll slow us down. But what I want to do now is move on to, well, firstly, at the time you became lead ICD, what confidence did you then have that you were receiving all out of specification results?
I had much more confidence because we had the process in place and I was receiving them for Legionella. We had also started to roll out Pseudomonas testing on a gradual basis. So I was starting to see results coming through, for example, the neonatal unit as well for Pseudomonas. So I was getting those results. At the time, that was the main focus of our testing, was Legionella and Pseudomonas, and not much else. The only other time that we might get results if there was an outbreak or an ICD had asked for testing to be undertaken in response to certain bacteria.
Now, what I want to do now is to look at the period after handover and your involvement with the adult bone marrow transplant unit. And I'd like you to take to a meeting that you appear to have had with Dr. Peters and Mr. Parry on the 25th of June 2015, which appears to be summarised in a note, which is Bundle 14, Volume 1, Document 16, page 337. And we see the top half is an email from Christine Peters, and the bottom half is another email from Christine Peters. But do you see how it says, thank you for the time today and arranging the meeting day with David Hall and the rep from Brookfield, David ?
Yes.
So what I want to ask is, so at this point, Professor Williams was away?
Yes.
Right. What was, and you've already explained your interest is in 4B. And so why are you interested in 4C at this meeting? Why are you there is the essence of the question.
So Professor Williams had asked me to cover for him as lead ICD while he was away.
Right.
But also at that point, there was discussion about me just moving to the Queen Elizabeth site from Glasgow Royal Infirmary. So I think both myself and Christine felt it would be a good opportunity for me to become familiar with the broader site, because at the time, Christine worked part-time and I would be covering her days off. So I needed to have some knowledge of the hospital as a whole as well.
So that's why the agenda, in a sense, covers Christine's territory.
Yes.
Right. Now, if we look in the note, we see at bullet point 8 a reference that I'm slightly thrown by, which I wonder where it might be an error. You see it says most of the rooms on 5B hemato-oncology. Should that be 4B at that point?
Yes, that's an error.
At this point in June 2015, why is there no mention in
Sorry, just that I'm following. That's point 8 should be
4B?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Now, if you read through this list, we see discussion of mechanical ventilation, HEPA filtered, positive pressure lobby rooms, where the extracts are, the absence of leak testing, pressure gauges, alarm systems, and pressure in item 9, pressure differentials. Now, that's not in all of the items, but those are the topics that get picked up across this list. And if we just go on to the next page, we have an air change rate at 10 discussed in the context of the 5B, I think that means 4B rooms. So if we go to the previous page, it goes 9, the 4B rooms, I'm assuming that is, are not designed to be positive pressure rooms, 10 kilopascals differential corridor, and over the page, the air change rate we think is 10 per hour. It wasn't 10 per hour, was it?
No.
No. What do you think it was actually at that point?
Around 6.
Right. And then we have commission and validation data, and effectively much discussion of all the traditional elements of ventilation in a hospital room that you find listed in SHTMO 301. The one that's missing is discussion of air change rates outside the isolation rooms. Why is that not in that meeting? Why are you not discussing air change rates outside isolation rooms at that point?
I think this is a problem with interpretation of guidance in the SHTMO 301 and the reference to neutropenic ward. I think most people at the time were taking that to mean neutropenic rooms.
Well, what we'll do is I'm going to ask you a second question, and then we'll jump ahead and we'll look at that document. There's also not mentioned in here in the context of 4B or 2A of the double doors that many witnesses, including those not experienced in ventilation, describe of being present at their predecessor units elsewhere. Again, why do you think that's not in this list?
I think that's not there because the SHTMO 301 is not descriptive enough.
Right, well, let's go and look at SHTMO 301. So we're going to find that in Bundle 16, Document 5, page 342. Now, I'd like to go to page 483, which I think might be the table, which is probably the place where we're going to find the information. Now, you're familiar with this document, I want to just check.
Yes.
Right, now, the inquiry has heard considerable evidence in the Edinburgh sessions about the entries in the 2014 version, but this is the 2009 version. And I'd like to start, as it were, by trying to understand what's going on in this table. So if we use, shall we say, a relatively uncontroversial location, such as operating theatre, which is 2/3 of the way down the left-hand side, this table is showing us what does the S in the first column mean?
That's your supply.
So that's telling you it should be mechanically ventilated.
Well, it's the supply of clean air is what it means.
Right.
Yes.
And then what does the next column, the 25, what does that mean?
So that is the air changes per hour.
And the next one?
That is your pressure. In that case, that's a positive pressure.
So that would mean that the air is going from the room outwards.
Yes.
And then you have an F7 filter. Mm-hmm. Now, is that what we've been talking about as a HEPA filter? Or is it just a more conventional?
No, that's not the same specification of a as a HEPA filter. That is less efficient than a HEPA filter.
And then we have a temperature range of 18 to 25.
Yeah.
Now, let's go and look at the neutropenic patient ward entry, which is about 9 rows down. If we ignore for a moment what neutropenic patient ward means, we'll discuss what that means and what it might mean and what the uncertainty is in a moment. What's it telling us that this guidance is proposing for the ventilation for that space?
So it's telling us 10 air changes per hour, positive pressure of 10 pascals and HEPA filtration.
Now, if you interpret that as a room, is it possible to build such a room without a lobby?
Yes, but I would prefer to see a lobby there.
Why?
Because if you're just focusing on the room and not the corridor, you can have ingress of contaminated air into the room, and your only protection is a door, one door. So if the door is left open for a period of time, the pressure will drop, and you will get ingress of contaminated air. So if you're in a situation where you do not have a HEPA-filtered corridor, adding a lobby, it's going back to that positive pressure cascade that I described, provides that additional layer of protection from unfiltered corridor air.
Again, thinking only about a potential isolation, single room,
Mm-hmm.
applying this standard, would this room have to have a sealed ceiling? Or could it have-
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
and would it have to have a wall that extended to reach the ceiling?
What, sorry?
A wall that
yes.
extended. Now, was it in fact the case that some of the isolation rooms in the hospital didn't have these two features?
Yes.
The HEPA filters that are mentioned here, are these...
All right, some sealed ceiling, yes. Wall extending to ceiling, yes. It was. I think it was your question. I
Yeah, so
didn't hear.
were there rooms isolation rooms in the new hospital in 2015 which had been built with suspended ceilings and walls that didn't extend right to the hard ceiling?
Yes.
Thank you.
When you come to the filters, are we talking about portable filters or filters within the ventilation system?
Within the ventilation system.
Right. Let's again look at this. If the definition, we'll come back to the definition in a moment, is for the whole ward, how would you achieve these requirements for a whole ward? What would that physically involve?
In terms of refurbishment, do you
Well, in
mean?
terms of, would it have to have a lobby at the entrance to the ward? If you're going to achieve 10 air changes and 10 Pascal positive pressure on a ward, would you have to have a lobby at the entrance to the ward?
I'm not convinced a lobby would be essential if you were achieving HEPA filtration in a corridor and a positive pressure of 10 pascals and air changes of 10. If I was to design a gold standard unit, I would put the lobby in place simply because it gives an extra layer of protection against outside corridor air as opposed to the corridor in the ward. So there's an extra degree of protection. But if you're in a situation where you have a corridor to this spec, and then you have an anteroom that's a positive pressure, and then you have the patient room at positive pressure, that's a fairly high degree of protection.
Right. Would you have to seal the whole ward from the rest of the hospital in order to achieve, if it's the whole ward that's been done?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that would be a fairly major construction project requiring HAI scribe and various control measures for other groups in the vicinity, particularly the neighbouring hemato-oncology ward 4C, because those patients would be at risk.
And again, the filters would be in the ventilation system, not portable ones. Right. Now, let's go back to you. The reason we went here, because you touched on what you felt was a lack of, I think, detail. What's the issues around these three words, neutropenic patient ward, that you feel there's some interpretation or there's some history of interpretation here?
Well, it doesn't discuss lobbies. They're not mentioned. It's not specific about double door entry. It doesn't discuss all the other areas of the ward and how you might apply positive, negative pressure HEPA filtration. Not all areas in a neutropenic patient ward can be positive pressure. There are what we would refer to as dirty facilities, for example, domestic services room, dirty utility. So,
because if you go 3 rows up, you have a row for dirty utility.
mm-hmm.
That requires 6 air changes and, more importantly, a negative pressure.
So essentially, when you're looking at this table, and I think this is part of the challenge for infection control teams, is you're having to bring together information from different sources and sometimes from different guidance documents. I should say that this has been recognised in RHI and NSS are now producing notes for boards on bone marrow transplant and hemato-oncology units to give infection control teams in particular much more detail around what we mean by a neutropenic patient ward and design of a bone marrow transplant unit.
Because I appreciate there's the issue within the ward about the features you just discussed, but there's also the question of, do you need to do it for the whole ward? Now, given at the time you had that meeting, we were looking at the minute, you were the ICD with responsibility for what is 4B. Given the patient cohort in 4B, shouldn't this guidance suggest that the whole of 4B would have been treated, HEPA filtered, positive pressure, 10 air changes an hour?
Yes.
Can you understand from all the meetings you've been in why it wasn't?
I believe that was a challenge of a retrofit in terms of what the air handling units could cope with, the ductwork, that sort of thing. This was not, a brand new build at this stage.
Because the unit was added into the project in 2013 or thereabouts.
So it was originally meant for the patients next door, the general haematology patients. So you're working in the constraints of a refurbishment, which is much more difficult. You don't have a blank sheet of paper that you can deliver a spec in that situation. So compromises, I suppose, have to be made to that spec.
So the idea that that ward then comprised individually protected, and you disagree about their appropriate protection, but individually protected rooms, is you see as the compromise as part of the process.
Yeah, I would have preferred to have seen anterooms built into that unit. But we were, because it's a refurbishment, we can't create anterooms because there simply isn't the space to do so. And you're faced, many times as an infection control doctor during this process, you're faced in very difficult situations in terms of decision making and risk assessment. Do you continue to pursue for what you would have as a blank slate and you would design, and risking, shutting down a service or people being at another hospital where there is an intensive care unit? So you're constantly having to balance the risk.
So if we take 4B, and I recognise I'm asking you to do hypotheticals here, but given that you explained that you sort of understand there's a compromise and you understand how the compromise came about, if it had been fully understood that this ward couldn't have 10 air changes an hour and couldn't all be HEPA filtered, would the option of returning to the Beatson staying at the Beatson and never coming back in 2013 have existed, as far as you understand it?
Sorry, just that I'm following. The question assumes you can't have the air changes. And
you can't have HEPA filter.
What did you say about
and you can't HEPA filter the whole ward.
Right, thank you.
If that's understood, if that was understood back in 2013, before, when decisions are being made, as far as you understand, did the option exist of staying at the Beatson permanently?
I don't know back then if that was discussed. My understanding
I appreciate
was,
that's not the question. It's, do you think the option existed in the sense that could the Beatson have coped with adult bone marrow transplant just staying there?
the building itself, yes, it could have, but the facilities attached to it, no. So there was no critical care.
Right.
And there had been an HDU, but I understand that the HDU beds were closing.
So that's an example of this compromise.
Building, yes.
Right. Now, if we go to the paediatric BMT, the ward contains paediatric BMT of 2A. Now, this is out of sequence. I was going to come to this later, but since we're looking at this table, to take things quickly, and we'll look at how you learnt this later, am I right in thinking that there comes a point when you realise that in Ward 2A, there are isolation rooms, and you get to discussion about whether they're the right type? That's right?
Yes.
But the whole ward is not positive pressured. You're nodding again?
Yes, sorry.
The whole ward's not HEPA filtered. Is that yes or no?
That's correct.
Yeah, and the whole ward's not 10 air changes an hour.
Correct.
Right. going back to this definition of neutropenic patient ward, why should a reader not just look at those three words and think, well, the whole of Ward 2A is a neutropenic patient ward? What's wrong with that as a concept?
So Ward 2A was not a full bone marrow transplant unit. So Ward 2A has essentially 3 different patient groups within it. So it has bone marrow transplant patients, it has general haematology patients, and it has oncology patients. So there are 3 groups with slightly different requirements. So if we think about the adult setting, we have bone marrow transplant in 4B, we have a separate ward for haematology 4C, and we have oncology at the Beatson. But in 2A, they're all combined. And that's why around that time, the design of the children's ward, hemato-oncology ward, was on a proportion of bone marrow transplant rooms only, rather than a full neutropenic ward, because many of the patients are not in fact neutropenic. So it was quite common at that time to have that sort of design.
What was the design at the old York Hill facility, the old Jehallian?
My understanding is it was very similar. I didn't see a specification, but I did have a folder given to me by a colleague, Dr. Balfour, that contained all the air sampling results and also some posters that had been presented at conferences that were describing an upgrade to create 8 isolation rooms from 6. And within that poster, there is reference to not having any contingency in the ward. So I'm making the assumption that it was not a fully neutropenic ward. I think it may have had a double door entry.
There does seem to be evidence of that.
And the proportion, which laterally was 8 in around, I think, 2013, 14.
So that's 8 air changes an hour?
No, sorry, 8 isolation rooms designated for BMT. And I believe they were HEPA filtered.
The isolation rooms?
Yes.
What about the whole ward? Do you have any knowledge about that?
I don't believe the whole ward was HEPA filtered, but I can't absolutely confirm that.
Sorry, my fault entirely. We're now talking about the...
Old Jehallian model?
Yes, the old Jehallian.
So I think you're saying that the old Jehallian had 8 isolation rooms, were HEPA filtered.
Yes.
It probably had a lobby, but you don't know whether it was HEPA filtered.
No.
Do you know what its air change rate was for the rest of the ward?
I don't.
No. Now, if you take a sort of purely legalistic approach to these things, and I suppose the people asking you questions are all lawyers, neutropenic patient ward seems very simple. It's got neutropenic patients in it. They may not be all of them, but there's quite a lot of them are neutropenic. At times, it varies. Therefore, the whole ward should be treated like this. Why is that wrong? Or why is that not the right answer?
I don't think it's wrong anymore with everything that we've learned from the RHC site. I think through the process, what became evident to me is that on paper, 8 bone marrow transplant units look fine based on the numbers of
rooms, rather.
Yes, rooms, based on the number of transplant procedures, and there was clinical input into that. But what is not thought about is contingency. So what happens when something goes wrong in that room? And that was often the case. There were issues, obviously, with the ceiling of the room. There's the need for annual verification reports. There's the need for maintenance of air handling units. And there's no contingency.
Because there's not a spare air handling.
There's no, and there's nowhere to put children safely. There's no other ward that could accommodate these patients. It's not unique to the RHC. It's happened elsewhere in Scotland, but it is something that needs to be, in my view, considered now when we're thinking about the design of these units. It's not as simple as just a proportion of rooms for a procedure. We need to have contingencies should something go wrong. So
and
I've
that
changed my
contingency
view on
would
that.
making the whole ward meet the standard.
Yes.
If we go back to 2009, so obviously you weren't involved in 2009.
No.
But given you just said what you said, I'd like to understand what you think a sort of fair-minded approach to these things would have been back then. Where was the consensus back in 2009? But whether this table, which is the 2009 version, requires the whole ward to be 10-10 HEPA filtered.
I don't know why the decision was made. I believe it was based on the model at York Hill and the number of rooms they had for bone marrow transplant at York Hill. I think at the time, for such a complex unit, and thinking about what Dr. Hood did with the Beatson, I think there should have been more expert input. So, you know, GGC had designed the Beatson,
So this is the predecessor of 4B.
yes.
Yes.
But, you know, this is still a complex project, a children's paediatric bone marrow transplant unit. I think perhaps if there had been more expert input into it, then maybe these conversations would have happened.
You didn't really answer my question. If you're saying that now, knowing what we all know now, including this experience in this hospital, one would interpret neutropenic patient ward to include any new Ward 2A type facility. That's now. Back then, effectively, what would have been the consensus about whether the new 2A was a neutropenic patient ward? What would have been the view taken at the time?
I think it would have been a ward with neutropenic rooms.
Right. Even though the guidance doesn't talk about a good ward with neutropenic.
Yes.
Sorry, just give me that again. Could you just repeat your last answer?
I said yes. Even though the guidance doesn't include neutropenic patient rooms as a row, and you said
yes.
Said yes. I actually agree with you.
Sorry, it's entirely my fault. We're looking at the situation in 2009. The version 1 guidance is available, and Dr. Inkster is being asked as to what would be the consensus as the interpretation of what was required by neutropenic ward room. Have I got the question right?
The question is what would the consensus been of whether neutropenic patient ward applied to Ward 2A as it's being envisaged in 2009. And I'm interpreting your answer, Dr. Inkster, as it would have been interpreted as neutropenic patient isolation rooms within the ward, yes. But the rest of the room ward wouldn't have required to be at this standard.
Yes.
Thank you.
And you've already explained, and I won't go over it again, why you think that the sort of literalist, legalist approach doesn't work because of the mixed patient cohort. Right. I think what we'll do is we'll move on. We may come back to this. We set this off the screen, please. Now, if we go back to that meeting, we won't put it on the screen. Remember the meeting on the 25th of June between you, Dr. Peters, and Mr. Parry. We have various emails, which I put in your document bundle, and I don't think I need to take you to them potentially, which describe what you're raising with other people in the hospital about Ward 4B. Now, what I'd like to understand is what's the point you're trying to make in June, July 2015 about Ward 4B?
Based on the information that we had managed to glean, we felt that it wasn't safe for patients to be in the unit.
And ultimately, was there a decision made that the patients would return to the Beatson?
Yes.
Right. Now, am I right in thinking that your involvement, as opposed to Dr. Peters' involvement, was in a sense because Professor Williams was away?
Yes, that's correct.
Right, and he returns. Now, in early July, you resign your ICD sessions. I want to come back to that, but before I do that, I want to look at the paediatric ward. So you explain in your statement at page 96 paragraph 273 is that you received an email from Sandra Devine. If we can put that on the screen, that's bundle 14, volume 1, page 263. And this is an email from Sandra Devine. She's asking you for information about Ward 2A. And this is presumably just before Professor Williams returns.
Yes.
the context. Is this when you first realised that there were no HEPA filters in the isolation rooms? In
Yes.
2A, right. Now, we've had a big conversation already about the differences between 2A here and 2A in the old York Hill, but I'm assuming the old York Hill had HEPA filters in the rooms, the
Yes.
isolation rooms, right? Yes, no. The one thing we haven't talked about in the context of the old Schehallien and the new Schehallien is air change rates outside and inside the isolation rooms. So I know you've explained that you didn't know what the air change rates were outside the isolation rooms in the old York Hill, and you're nodding at me.
Yes.
At this point, when you get involved, do you discover not only whether there are HEPA filters, but what the air change rates are in the isolation rooms in Ward 2A?
No, I didn't know.
And did you discover what the air change rates are in the general part of 2A?
No.
No. And we've discussed neutropenic already. Just to wrap up that topic on neutropenic, you're aware of the Innovative Design Solutions report in 2018
Yes.
for this ward. The view is like it's expressed by the author of that, Mr. Lambert, that neutropenic patient ward means what it says on the tin. If there are neutropenic patients in it, you do the whole ward.
Yes.
Back in 2018, was that part of the consensus, or was that an unusual position to take?
I don't recall any discussions about the specification in 2018 because we were dealing with the water incident and the ventilation issue came into the latter part of that year. I was involved in initial design meetings with Mr. Powry and Matthew Lambert, I think at the time, into 2019. There's some input from Peter Hoffman, but then I resigned from the role, so I don't know what the discussions were.
Well, I won't
at that
press you
point.
on that. No. What I want to do is pick up one more issue, which is, if you go to page 78 of your statement, you set out from paragraph 217 to 225 your view of the role of the IPC team in commissioning and validation. Now, I'm not going to go through that in detail, but I just have one question, which is, are you aware of whether a stage 4 HI scribe was produced? It seems to be what's required by the 2014 version of SHFN 03. Was produced in 2015 when the hospital was handed over by either the project team or estate or IPC for the new hospital.
I'm not aware of that.
Would you have known to look for one then?
Absolutely, yes.
Did you look for one?
No.
Why didn't you look for one?
I suppose at the time I came over, I had a very narrow remit, which was the regional. I didn't actually move across until middle of August. So no, I didn't look for one at that point in time.
Was there a point when you did actually start thinking, I wonder if there's an HI scribe for this new hospital?
I can't recall thinking about that then.
Looking back on it, but why?
Well, I suppose I made an assumption that it would be in place because it was very clear in the CEL and the SHFN. I mean, it was a major construction project, so that's possibly why I didn't think to ask, because I just assumed it would be there.
Now, before we go on to your resignation, I'd like to just pick up issues about aspergillus in the ward that happen over the next, this is in Ward 2A, over the next few years. There seem to be a number of different PAGs and IMTs that we have access to in 15, 16, 17 and onwards. Looking back on this now, to what extent do the ventilation arrangements in 2A, before it's rebuilt, have, from your point of view, any relevance to the existence or otherwise of aspergillus infections in that ward?
I think it's possible they were relevant. There are various sources of aspergillus, and obviously construction and demolition is one. And that is where you need your protective environment for immunosuppressed patients, plus potentially additional measures, depending what's going on site. So there was construction, and we recognised that in the IMTs at the time. The other issue that came to light was water damage, and water ingress, which is often an under-recognised and poorly managed situation. By that time, I'd had a reasonable amount of experience in dealing with water damage, and you find the same problems in that people don't understand the need to remove all of the mouldy material. They may just focus on the tile that the water is dripping from. They don't do full inspections of ceiling voids, and they don't remove all the adjacent material, and then that's left, and a ceiling void is a perfect atmosphere for mould to grow, and that then becomes a source. And it's a bit different from water leaking directly from a chilled beam, because fungal spores are released in bursts. So you can have a water leak at one end of a ward, but patients at the other end are affected because of the burst of spores and how they travel. They're very buoyant and speculated, so
Would they move through the ceiling
they
void?
will move through. And that's why we have measures in place for construction, because they will move very far. And if a ward isn't appropriately ventilated with HEPA filtration and protection, then yes, there can be ingress of spores. So there's construction and water damage were the main issues at the time, but also the damp conditions potentially created and the dust from the chilled beams were problematic.
We'll come back to chill beams later, but I'm just trying to make the connection between the discussion we've had about a neutropenic ward and isolation rooms and the state of understanding then about whether it should be a whole ward that is treated according to SHTMO3 or just the rooms. Now, if the approach is taken of just isolating 8 rooms or 4 rooms or 1 point even fewer perhaps, and putting in the most vulnerable patients in those rooms, then surely the issue of Aspergillus risk wouldn't arise because they're in their rooms, so they're safe. But it did arise, so what's happened there? Have they left the rooms?
So what's happened there is, I believe at the time, some of the rooms had been closed because of issues with ductwork, it goes back to my issue with contingency. I was beginning to think that there were patients with other conditions other than bone marrow transplants that should have been in those rooms, but there wasn't enough rooms for these patients. So in particular, patients with acute lymphoblastic leukemia who can become very immunosuppressed due to the nature of the chemotherapy that they get, they were certainly being managed at times in the main ward.
In the non-isolation rooms?
In the non-isolation rooms, because there wasn't sufficient accommodation to move them into those rooms.
Isn't that another reason or a reason to think that neutropenic patient ward in the context of paediatric hemato-oncology has to be the whole ward because the numbers are so small that the pressures will cause these problems?
Absolutely, and I think the other thing to consider is the paediatric setting. I observed myself that it was very difficult for children to be confined to a room for the length of time they needed to be for bone marrow transplant. And I did see patients on occasion being let out of the room and into the corridor. I can understand why, that.
Well, there were facilities for them in the ward.
Yes,
built there.
Absolutely.
There were playrooms, there was the Teenage Cancer Trust, there was family dining room. So
yes.
Is that not another reason to think we have to treat the whole ward?
Yes, absolutely.
I mentioned that you resigned your sessions.
Yes.
Now, what I want to do is just focus on the time of that. Am I right in thinking that there's a meeting between you and Professor Jones and Dr. Peters and Dr. Cruikshank on something like the 9th or 8th of July 2015? And your resignation letters go in after that. Have I got the order right?
I don't recall the date of the meeting.
Can you help us whether it's before or after the letters go in?
I think before, because I think I indicated my resignation and I was asked to produce what I've referred to as a sort of statement of events.
So you think we should read, and we'll go and look at your letter in a moment, but you think you should read your letter and that of Dr. Peters as following up a discussion with other people?
Yes.
And I'm right in thinking the people you would have had the meeting with would have been Professor Jones and Dr. Cruikshank?
Yes.
Why them?
So, at the time, Professor Jones was the head of service for microbiology and Anne Cruikshank was the clinical director. So we had different line management structures. So for infection control, we would report to Professor Williams and Tom Walsh, but for microbiology, we would report to Professor Jones and Anne Cruikshank. In terms of job planning, it would be microbiology senior staff that we would need to talk to about job planning and relinquishing sessions.
Because were you full-time at this point?
Yes, I was.
Yes. So you would have had 10 sessions. You're nodding
Yes.
again. You remember the transcript
Yes.
person. And how many sessions at this point did you have in infection control?
I think at that point for regional, I had 3 sessions a week.
And the other 7 sessions of microbiology?
Yes.
And so Dr. Cruikshank and Professor Jones are your management in a
Yes.
sense, but for microbiology.
Yes.
So you go to them.
Yes.
Right, let's look at your letter. So this is Bundle 14, Volume 1, Document 27, page 416. So is this the summary document that you say you're asked to produce?
Yes.
Right. What I want to do is to go through this just to help us out, not in detail because we can read it, but just to understand what is it that you're raising as issues. The first thing is the first paragraph covering Professor Williams. Is this when he's in China?
Yes, I believe.
Right, and then we've just seen email exchanges.
Yes.
Could it be a slightly longer period given some of the dates in the emails? Maybe that's not important, but you certainly cover for him.
Yes.
Right. And then 25th of June, is that the meeting with Mr. Parry that we've just been and looked at the minute for?
Yes, that's
Right,
correct.
okay. And then at the bottom you have your concern about lack of information.
Yes.
Right. Go to the next page. And then you discuss more events over the next few days, including, I don't see you mentioning the HEPA filters in Ward 2A in this email, but does that come at the same point?
I have a recollection that was earlier because patients hadn't moved in.
Right. That was, go back to page 263. That was it was the 3rd of June. Yes, it is earlier. Right. If we go back to page 417. And then there's more discussion about events of the 29th and 30th of June and 31st of June. Now, if we go over the page, what I'm thinking here is effectively this a narrative about what you're told, what you're not told, and what it means.
Yes.
Right. We'll go to the end, page 419. Who was this sent to, this document?
I recall it being sent to myself and Christine Peters and John Hood.
Would Dr. Jones, Professor Jones and Cruikshank have received it? Or perhaps they
Professor
wouldn't have.
Jones may have because he was the microbiologist for the unit. I don't believe Anne Cruikshank would have received it. I would
Okay.
need to check emails.
Were you permitted to resign these sessions, or rather demit them, as Mr. Walsh would have put it?
No.
No. If we go to page 420, and you've set out your reasons, it's the last 3 paragraphs that seem different from the previous one. So everything else seems to be describing, I found out something, I am concerned because, and this seems to be different. What's the point you're making in the third last and second last paragraphs?
I felt at the time that people were not listening to myself and Dr. Peters. I wasn't clear what our role was within infection control at the time. We were certainly not autonomous. We did not have the ability to request information and receive it, and that was very evident from that period of time. I wasn't really clear as to what my role as the sector ICD and the person who would be, involved with this unit was at the time, because it was then taken back over by Professor Williams. So I wanted clarity on, what is my role in this team?
Because you were
What do I
only
have
receiving information.
responsibility for? Because I stopped receiving any communication about it when he came back.
So you only receive information when he's away, effectively.
Yes, but despite it being part of my sector ICD role. So I was confused about my role. And ultimately, I was concerned about patient safety and the fact that myself and Dr. Peters, I didn't feel we were really being listened to. And there was a lack of information sharing for a site that both of us were to become responsible for. And I felt it was really important to get that information.
I appreciate that you weren't allowed to debate or resign your sessions, and neither was Dr. Peters, and you continue working in these roles. But is there some form of review or investigation carried out into the points you've raised?
At that time?
Yeah.
No, I recall being informed by Professor Jones that there would be some sort of HR investigation. I remember being contacted by him on holiday at the beginning of August.
And eventually, do you end up speaking to Dr. Stewart, an HR person?
Yes, I do.
Now, if we could go to, what is it that Dr. Stewart wanted to talk to you about? We'll take this off the screen.
So there had been lots of concerns raised around the time that we had resigned. There was a lot of tension in the team. Anne Cruikshank was appointed into a new additional role as the clinical director, because I think it was recognised that there were what was being labelled as personality issues between certain ICDs. And they wanted to explore, my understanding is they wanted to explore the culture of infection control at that time, as opposed to any of the risks that we had highlighted in our resignation letters.
So in your meeting with Dr. Stewart and the HR person who was with him, did you discuss these cultural communications issues, relationship issues with him?
Yes, we did.
Did you attempt to discuss the patient safety concerns you have with him?
I think I did briefly to sort of set the scene as to how these issues had arisen.
And eventually, does he send an email round? If we go and look at, I think it's Bundle 14, Volume 1, Document 45, page 472. Now, this is an email which you receive on the 30th of October. Do you remember receiving this email?
Yes, I do.
When he says, please see attached letter, is that the text of the attached letter below?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. What did you think when you read this response?
I felt at that time that this was being made about personalities. I felt that myself and Dr. Peters were being labelled as difficult and risk averse. And that was all there was to see here. It was personality issues rather than any actual genuine concern that there were patient safety issues about the issues that we were addressing.
Dr. Stewart's given evidence a few weeks ago that he was aware of the reasons he resigned, but the instruction he received from Dr. Armstrong was to carry out a review of these cultural communications issues alone.
Yes.
Does that match with your understanding of what he was doing?
Yes.
Right. Did you attempt to go back to him about the patient safety issues?
I did, yes.
So would that be in an email a letter to him in early October?
Yes, that's
a
correct.
long letter. Now, that is Bundle 14, Volume 1, Document 48, page 478. Now, at one level, I'll be cutting it short, as there are a series of emails from Christine Peters between the two.
Yes.
Right. But this is a joint letter by the two of you.
That's correct.
No. Again, we can read it, but if we read it and compare it to your note for your resignation, to what extent are they different?
I think they're a combination of issues that I was experiencing at the time, but with the addition of some issues that Dr. Peters was dealing with that I was less involved with. So it's really a combination of both our experiences at the time and both of our concerns.
Now, why was it that you were going back to Dr. Stewart with these concerns?
Because I could see no evidence that anything had changed, and in the interim, before writing this letter, I think it was around that time I was informed that the Beatson would be moving back.
Right. And how did that come about? How do you learn about that?
Professor Williams contacted me and informed me that I would be leading on the move back. I would need to check the dates to be absolutely sure, but it was around this time.
If we look in the same bundle, page 296, it's around about this, early September. And then if we go on to the next page, there's a update document that he's produced. Is this something you've seen before?
Yes, I've seen that before.
So would this suggest that the discussion of the patients moving back is in early September?
No, so this, I'm referring to the adult bone marrow transplant unit.
Ah, right, my mistake. Well, I'll take that off the screen. So you say there was discussions between, that you received some information from him, instructions from him about the patients moving back. What did he want you to do?
He wanted me to lead on it.
And what did you lead on it?
Yes, I did.
What did you discover and what did you do?
I discovered that in the interim, nothing appeared to have changed. So I was asked to lead on it. I asked for, can I have the original specification, the validation, the air sampling? Nothing was forthcoming. At the time of the initial meeting, they actually had the keys to the ward. So they were moving in 3 weeks. That was the plan. I had none of this information and I was expected to sign off that move. I was not comfortable because nobody at that point could tell me what had actually changed.
What had actually changed? Did you find out eventually?
I think there was some work done to make some of the ceilings solid. And there were communications during that time between Professor Williams and Peter Hoffman that were not shared with me. So I was put in a position with no information, but expected to make, a major decision about moving this unit back. So I felt, not dissimilar to how I'd felt earlier in the year. And I then requested support from Health Protection Scotland. I wanted them to come in and have a look and to develop, an optimal specification. And when I brought them in, there was some information then was more forthcoming because they were asking questions and colleagues then did send some information, but not all of the information.
Is this the process that ultimately results in the December 2015 SBAR by HPS about the...
That's correct.
Right. About this ward. How was you contacting Health Protection Scotland for support treated by management in NHS-GGC?
I think there was frustration because they were ready to move the patients back. So the clinical teams and the clinical managers had a plan for moving those patients back in. And essentially I come along and say, no, I'm not happy about this. So I can understand why they were frustrated. In terms of infection control management, I felt at the time there was resistance from the infection control manager and the lead infection control doctor that I was bringing Health Protection Scotland, and they referred to previous input from Health Facility Scotland. Now, to me, that input was not particularly clear at the time. It appeared to be input in relation to air sampling, but not, in fact, input in relation to the specification of the unit, which was what I wanted to get advice on.
I get the impression, and I'm going to stop me if I've misunderstood this, that not just you, but lots of people are sort of flailing around in the dark here and slightly unaware of what's happened and what's going on. Is that
Yes.
Is that a fair analysis?
That's correct.
Who else is... I mean, effectively, is anybody fully informed about what's going on here at this point?
I don't believe they were, no.
So that would include Professor Williams and Mr. Loudon, Mr. Parry, and all the people involved?
Yes, everyone.
Let's go back to your letter, or we won't go back to it, we'll go back to this point in the story, which is early November 2015, when you sent your new letter with Dr. Peters. Do you get a response from Dr. Stewart?
We did get a response, and he said something along the lines, well, now HPS and HFS are involved, so maybe that would give us reassurance. But I felt at that time, well, they were only involved because I had to push for their involvement, and they were only involved in one of the aspects on the list at the time, although I recall a conversation with Anne Cruikshank, and we did suggest to them that we might need some more input in relation to some of the other aspects.
Did you go back to Dr. Stewart again around about Christmas time? Or might it have been Christine Peters who went back to?
I think that was Christine.
Right. What I want to do is look at a report which we've got, which is a bundle 14, volume 1, document 45, page, I think it's 464. So this is called an informal review of infection control issues, which is produced by Dr. Stewart and his colleague from HR. I wondered when you first saw this.
I first saw this in a bundle for this inquiry.
So you weren't provided with this at the time,
No,
even though you'd raised the issue?
no, wasn't provided with it.
And so in terms of substantive detail, all you had was the letter of the 30th of October that we just looked at?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Could you look at the bottom of this page, paragraph 6? Now, I've discussed it with Dr. Stewart, and he, I think, to be fair to him, doesn't have a full recollection of what this might mean, but he effectively gave a particular narrative of what it meant, looking at it now. I wonder if you can look at the final paragraph. There seemed to be some discussions. I wondered if you could look at this, we'll go through this paragraph and see what you think about some of the individual sentences and whether you think in a sense he's fair at the time or what's wrong with his views expressed. So the first sentence, there is a need for greater clarity around levels of accountability in the decision-making process, especially when there are conflicting views, opinions. Looking back at this point, autumn 2015, is that a fair comment or would you disagree with it?
I would say there was a need for clarity. It wasn't clear to me what my role was at the time.
I will take the next sentence in two parts. On the one hand, there are reports from ICDs having their professional authority undermined by the overturning decisions by the IC management team. Is that something you would have told him?
Yes, I agree with that.
Right. And you and Christine would have told him that?
Yes.
Right. Whilst on the other hand, there are reports of ICDs not taking decisions when given authorities do so. Am I right in thinking that's talking about you?
I would imagine with the timing, yes.
Yeah. So might that be that you not signing off decisions
Yes.
that you're being asked to sign off? Now, this final sentence seems possibly important, but though to be fair to Dr. Stewart, he doesn't remember writing it. Whilst it is clear that concerns for patient safety is the primary motivator for ICDs when arriving decisions, there appears to be on occasion to be a lack of appreciation by some ICDs of the need to risk assess decisions from an organisational political perspective. Now, before we get to the last three words, I mean, you've already discussed the importance of balancing risk
Yes.
already. So do you feel that you were risk assessing decisions at the time?
So as an ICD, I was risk assessing on an almost daily basis on a very simple level, whether to close a ward for an outbreak or, allow the service to continue so that patients might get treatment. You're always risk assessing as an ICD. But in those sort of situations, you're fully informed in your risk assessment. You've got all the information available to you. But here, I was not fully informed to undertake a risk assessment, and at times relying on things like particle counts only. So it's about being informed and having all the information to hand to enable you to make that risk assessment safely. And that wasn't happening at the time.
Now, what about the last three words? Now, I appreciate you didn't see them at the time, but in the context of the IPC team of late 2015, what do you think could have been meant then by organisational political perspective as something you need to consider?
My reading of this is that organisational reputation was the priority.
Do you think that anything changed in respect to the culture of the IPC team as a result of you raising these issues in the latter part of 15 with Dr. Peters or Dr. Stewart's report?
No.
What was done about the patient safety issues you raised in these issues in the second half of 2015?
Nothing that I recall other than me trying to address the issues with adult BMT and bringing in external experts at the time.
Now, you've mentioned the appointment of Dr. Cruikshank. Do you think her role was effective, that she was brought in to do?
I did find her role to be effective. I found Anne Cruikshank was a huge support to myself and Dr. Peters, and I felt that she had a very good understanding of the culture. And she was very supportive, and I felt that having her come along to the senior management team meetings and infection control, I felt did make a difference, and there was more accountability, I think, and maybe more discussion about certain issues that might be stimulated by her. She was, someone who, I felt took a lot of action. She wasn't a bystander. She was very proactive.
But one more question before the break. Her role wasn't continued beyond May 2016. Why do you think that was?
I seem to recall discussions at the time feeling that once there'd been a change in the lead ICD role, that she was comfortable to step aside. I think also possibly for her, she was a busy biochemist and clinical director for the whole of lab, so this was, an extra workload, and I felt maybe that was a factor as well. But I think she felt comfortable that perhaps at that time things might be starting to change.
Thank you. My lord, this might be a good place to break for the morning coffee break.
Yes, Dr. Inkster, as I've said, we usually take a coffee break about this time. Could I ask you to be back for 12 o'clock?
Yes.
Who's that?
Ms. McIntosh.
Thank you, my lord. Teresa, what I'd like to do now is turn to the completion of the story about the return of the adult bone marrow treatment unit to the hospital. Now, you've covered it in extremely high level of detail from paragraphs 243 to 257 of your statement, and described a lot of events along that journey. What I'd like to do is simply look at the March 2017 options appraisal that goes to the Acute Service Committee of the board, and pick out a few things from that, and in a sense wrap up the topic that way. So firstly, if we put it on the screen, it's Bundle 27, Volume 7, Document 6, page 158. Page 158. Thank you. So firstly, when would you have first seen this document or something similar to it?
I would have seen that around that time, I believe, yes.
So effectively, is this a report to a subcommittee of the board?
Yes.
And seeking options, giving out options for the changes that were eventually made to allow the patients to return?
That's correct.
Right. Now, I wanted just to, in a sense, pick out some of your comments within your paragraph by reference to this as an aid memoir. If we can go to, we look at this document, it seems to consist of a summary document, which is this page and the next page with a recommendation. And then over the page, there's a report. Now, what I want to do is, using your experience that we've just touched on in 2015, I want to look at the paragraphs on background. And it's the second paragraph of background. And I wondered to what extent that paragraph reflects your understanding at the time of what the reasons for the return were, the nature, the anticipated length of the return, and indeed the following paragraph, and the reason that the return didn't happen in 2015.
So my understanding is it was to be short term, and that it appeared to me that the major change was the ceilings. And
So this is in
making the ceilings
2015.
solid.
You thought the return in 2015 was to be a short-term departure back to the Beatson.
Oh, no, I didn't know.
You didn't.
No.
What? So if we look at these two paragraphs, so the first sentence is the first sentence that the unit had to return to the Beatson Western Scotland Cancer Centre in July 2015, following identifying air quality issues in the new transparent unit. Is that correct?
I would say it was more than that. It wasn't just about air quality issues. It was a suboptimal specification.
But that's not there. The next sentence is, the return was predicated on being short-term, with further remedial works to be undertaken to improve air quality in the ward. Were the works that you saw done that you were asked to approve in order to improve air quality?
I didn't approve those works at the time.
No, but you asked to approve them.
Yes, I asked, air quality.
Were they about air quality?
I asked to improve the specification.
No, I'll rephrase my question. The works that you were asked to approve, because you were given
Yes.
works to approve, they had the keys already. If we look at what those works were they, from your perspective, did they appear to be designed to improve air quality in the ward?
No.
What did they look like they were designed to achieve?
All they looked like they were designed to achieve was solid ceilings in the bedrooms. So they didn't look to me to be achieving higher air changes, or maintaining a high pressure, or having solid ceilings also in the bathrooms.
So there weren't going to be solid ceilings in the bathroom at that stage?
I believe at that point there were not solid ceilings in the bathrooms, but I can't quite recall.
The last sentence of the second paragraph, remedial works was completed by October 15, and at this time the service began to make plans to move back to the hospital. That is correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. The first sentence of the next paragraph, is that correct?
I would say the infection control doctor rather than the team.
Right. Why would you say that?
Because the infection control manager and lead ICD appeared to agree with the move back and allocated that task to me, which was to happen 3 weeks later. So they had not chosen to question anything in regards to the specification or validation or air sampling of that unit. So I think at that stage it would have been the sector ICD raising concerns.
The final sentence, the rather long one that begins, following the receipt of recommendations from HPS with regard to the required specification, Appendix 1, the infection control team advised the specification did not meet required environmental standards for a BMT unit, and therefore they were unable to support return to the hospital. Is that A, actually you rather than the team as a whole, and B, is it correct in other respects?
So at that point, there was more infection control team involvement with the options appraisal. So when we had been through the options appraisal process, both the infection control manager and the associate nurse director agreed with the infection control position.
But there was no infection control involvement in the options appraisal, and you've discussed that in your statement.
There was infection control involvement in the options appraisal, but we didn't agree with it.
And then this paragraph, a further schedule of work was agreed and scoped in 2016 with additional costs of circa something, which would deliver improvements that would meet the full specification outlined by HPS. Is that this process where you didn't agree, the team didn't agree with the proposed things? Right. If we step forward onto page 166. Where options are assessed. So the top option is remain at the cancer centre, but the option 2 is level 4B of the hospital. And you see the sentence begins at the end, however option, and if we go over the page, and there's a report that it didn't score well against criteria to meet environmental standards. Is that accurate? An accurate way of summarising your concerns about that option during the options appraisal process? It didn't meet environmental standards.
It didn't meet the desired specification.
Yes.
And
do you think
environmental conditions in terms of air quality and air sampling.
Do you think environmental standard really gives the full nature of the way it didn't meet the specifications?
No, I don't believe it does.
If we go to page 172. And the option is discussed in more detail here. Now, what I'm intrigued about here is the interplay between this 4B adult unit and Ward 2A. And I'm wondering if something I can put to you, you consider it to be a reasonable thought at the time, which is March 17. So I recognise that benefit of hindsight might give a different answer. But looking at the time when you were lead ICD, if it's the case that the facility in 4B didn't then meet the standard in SHTM 0301 for neutropenic rooms or HPS guidance, and the main concern is that of airborne infections, particularly invasive fungal infections due to organisms such as Aspergillus, and I'm never going to pronounce this right, but zygomycosis?
Zygomycosis, yes.
Due to air quality. If that's true, then look at the next paragraph. It's also true for the Children's Hospital, isn't it?
Yes.
Where were the proposed changes to change the Children's Hospital? The Ward 2A at this point in March 2017?
I think in 2016, I was given 2 options for improving the specification, but just of the 8 rooms. So there were 2 options, either to continue with the PPVL concept and make sure the rooms were adequately sealed, or upgrade them according to SHTM 0301. And I chose the SHTM 0301 option, making use of the anteroom. So I asked for that to be the positive pressure cascade design that I've spoken about, because we didn't have the HEPA filtered corridor, and that would provide patients with an extra layer of protection. So the lobby would be 10 pascals and the bedroom would be plus 20.
But this options appraisal, unless I've misunderstood it, involves giving HEPA filtering the whole of Ward 4B, doesn't it?
Yes.
And the options, 2 options that you are discussing for Ward 2A in 2016 are only involve treating the individual rooms. So given that the board has been told that the BMT unit in the Children's Hospital doesn't meet the standard either, wouldn't it have been a good idea in March 17 to have been looking at a similar upgrade to 4B for 2A in March 17?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Was that something that was being discussed beyond the options paper for the individual rooms?
So at the time, when there were several meetings in 2016 to discuss the upgrade and how many rooms would be upgraded, and we were told, and it was handed over to me by several individuals, that we would only be upgrading a certain number of rooms at the time, and that there was no scope to upgrade anymore.
But the board's now aware in March 17 that the ward doesn't meet the standards.
Yes.
Now, how does this fit back to your discussion with me an hour ago about what SHTM 0301 means for a paediatric hemato-oncology ward? I've been asking you 2 questions. One is, what's the current consensus? And what's the consensus back in 2009? Given that this is, I don't know, a year and a half before Mr. Lambert's work in Innovative Design Solutions, what do you think the consensus was in 2017 about what standard Ward 2A should have been at in terms of whole ward protection?
I believe the consensus was to leave it as it is at that point due to barriers to upgrade it.
And what barriers would those have been?
First of all, contingency. So with the adult beats in, we could move them back. We didn't have anywhere to move children to. So there was risk of shutting down what is a national service, which would mean that very sick children did not get treatment. So that was an aspect, lack of contingency, where would the children go? And the second issue that is discussed and is minuted in, I think, later on in 2017 is the cost of doing so.
I wonder if we can go to page...
Sorry, Ms. McIntosh,
Of course.
do we have an answer? Your question was, what was the consensus in 2017 as to what was required for a unit such as was accommodated in 2A? Now,
Yes, we have the answer of what was
I'm
done.
not quite sure we got an answer to that.
But what do you think? I mean, you were involved in a 2016 exercise in selecting 2 options. And I appreciate that those options were in the context of both contingency and financial pressures that would have made what was ultimately done difficult to do. But given that ultimately the patients were moved from 2A to 6A while 2A was refitted, that at least that demonstrates there is an alternative. One could do exactly that. And it's not a very attractive alternative, I accept that. But in March 17, if you'd been asked the straight question is, you have to design if you asked the straight question, is this ward compliant with SHTM 0301? I'm assuming you'd say, no, it's not.
Yes, correct.
Right. If you were asked, what do I need to do to get this to compliance? What would you have said?
I would have said that, well, all the rooms would need to be upgraded to HEPA filtered rooms, exactly the same specification that Health Protection Scotland provided for the adult BMT room, with a HEPA filtered corridor, with a protected double door entry. That's what I would have asked for.
But your reason why it wasn't done is to do with the capacity, contingency and the cost.
Yes, so later in 2018, the Beatson had moved across and we were able to utilise bone marrow transplant beds in that unit for the children.
But that wasn't an option that was available.
It wasn't available then. And we couldn't send them anywhere else. We couldn't send them over for transplants to the Beatson because there's no paediatric services on site and there's no paediatric critical care.
Now, the final thing before I take it away from this document is if we go to page 175, we'll see the recommendation from HPS pasted in here, as it were. In the middle of that, bedroom air changes of 10 air changes now must be achieved. As far as you understand it, in March 17, at the end of the options appraisal, had it been realised by that point that 10 air changes could not be achieved with the ventilation system?
Yes, it had.
Right. Thank you. If we take it off the screen, I'd like to make a brief return, not that we've really been there before, to water. And I'd like to turn to the to paragraph, page 205 of your statement. And paragraph 5, nope, I've done that wrong. To page 164 of your statement. Yes, to paragraph 506. Now, you've described in your statement in a number of places the incident with the aseptic pharmacy in January 16.
Yes.
We've also heard evidence from Susan, from other people who were present. And what do you think the principal learning lesson is from this incident about the way the infection prevention control team was functioning at the time this incident occurred in January 16?
So at the time, I didn't feel it was functioning particularly well in terms of the team and relationships with the states. The aseptic pharmacy, they have their own guidelines for water testing and they were having problems and they were not getting support with those problems they felt from local estates. When I talked to Professor Williams at the time, he said it was an estates issue. So there was a sort of debate as to who was to support this aseptic pharmacy. Partly, I think, because they weren't following recognised water safety policies, but their own guidance called the Orange Guide at the time. And I was asked to help them by the biomedical scientists in Glasgow Royal who could see the results and could see that they weren't getting any help. So I gave them some support starting in February of 2016.
Now, if we think about this series of cases in January 16 in the context of what is to come, might it have been possible to realise at this point that there was a issue of water contamination or systemic contamination in the water system at this point? And if so, what would you have needed to know to work that out at the time?
I don't believe so at the time. They were doing routine monthly testing. They had elevated TVCs. I asked for the lab to identify the organisms. It was Cupria vadis. We did a review of the unit. Pamela Janidis did a lot of work reviewing the unit, and we found reasons why there might be an issue. So when you're thinking about a contaminated water system, it's not necessarily systemic. It might be related to the actual periphery of the system, where these organisms are more likely to be found. And the reason it might be related to the periphery of the system is things like a lack of flushing, a lack of tap maintenance, or in fact practice. So discarding, disposing bodily fluids down sinks, that kind of thing.
And in this case, there was a particular sink that caused some anxiety in this.
Yes. So there was what we would call a little used outlet. So there was a sink in a changing area that was not being used by staff. So we took that one out and that left us with one remaining sink. Pamela, I think, had witnessed, and it's reported in minutes somewhere, that there was disposal of, waste inappropriately down sinks and there were some practice issues. We also had repeat testing, so we did some work around dosing, we disinfected the taps, and then we put in a programme of repeat testing, and those results remained negative, and in fact did so right through. Even in the 2018 incident, those results were still negative. So at that time, it looked to me like there was a local outlet issue that was explained by a little used outlet and practice. I wouldn't have thought at that time for a new hospital to have a systemic.
And so you're not saying you think you could have worked it out if you'd known more?
Oh, I mean, if I'd had access to DMA reports, then absolutely, but I didn't.
Well, we'll come back to what you might have done with the reports when we get to them in the story. But I wonder if we can go to Bundle 13, Document 71, page 533, which is a meeting of the IMT senior management team from the 25th of February 2016. I noticed that Mr. Walsh is in the chair and that you're present as ICD regional. In fact, is that a handy who's who in IPC at that point in time? Is there any major people in there without a job description who's missing?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Well, what I want to do is go to page 536. And I'm just going to make sure I've got my note. Here we are, yes. Item 8, subgroups, short light working groups, update. And the first one is water safety group. And Pariandes is in the first paragraph advising about an annual review of pseudomonas. And then the second paragraph, Teresa, I take it that's you.
Yes.
And you reported that there were no water risk assessments for the new hospital. And with regards to Legionella, pediatric BMT does not have this listed as a risk. Now, we now know that there were water risk assessments for the new hospital.
Yes.
So why did you think at this point in February 2016 that there were no water risk assessments for the new hospital?
Because we had been asking for them, amongst other things, and they weren't being produced, and we didn't have validation reports either, so...
Well, let's stay with the water risk assessments for the moment.
The impression we got was they didn't exist.
Who had you been asking?
So there were a series of emails. Christine had been asking, I believe, Mary Ann Kane, Tom Walsh, Ian Powrie. I had asked Ian Powrie. And nothing was shared with us.
And so you basically had done some research. That's what I'm effectively checking, and that's your research. You've asked Mr. Parry, Mary Ann Kane,
yes,
and Mr. Walsh. Now, it may be that Mr. Walsh didn't know, but we've asked Mr. Parry, and we discussed it with him. Now, what I want to do is you were to meet Mr. Parry to discuss this. What was the response when you went to see Mr. Parry to discuss this?
So this was the second meeting with Mr. Powrie. I'd previously met him, and that's when I highlighted the Legionella paediatric BMT risk. So I'm reporting back on this meeting at the time. I recall asking him for two things: Legionella risk assessment, but all the historical Legionella results, because there had been a meeting set up in December of 2015 to go over those exact things, and it had been cancelled. And the response I got at the time was that someone else was dealing with it.
And is it as a consequence of this meeting that you produced the outer specifications list?
Yes, so that was the first meeting that I had with him in early February. That's when we produced that.
They produced that. Now, what I'm intrigued by is you're now having a meeting with him in which you're discussing a piece of work. It's not just an inquiry. Your out of specification, what Mr. Clarkson refers to, the Inkster Parry list, as it were, that is produced. Where does it go?
No, sorry, that's a different document. So that came later during the water incident.
I see.
That was a document designed to make a decision as to whether point of use filters could come off. What I'm talking about is the notification of Legionella results by exception reporting to ICDs, because I'd obviously come from the Royal and that wasn't in place.
So this is purely who gets the information as opposed to what is tested?
Who gets it and when to send it.
Right.
Yeah.
But you still don't get told about the DMA Canyon report at this point?
I was told someone else was dealing with it.
But what I'm trying to say is, were you told anything about whether it existed?
I'm sure I asked him for Legionella risk assessments and Legionella water results, and the response I got was someone else was dealing with it. And that was the sort of line that myself and Christine Peters were given. I was also, I recall being told that at a water safety group as well. It was always that someone else was dealing with it. So we were not autonomous. It wasn't the case that we could ask for risk assessments or validation reports and get them. We were not getting them because someone else was dealing with it.
So what difference would it have made in early 2016 if you had known what's in the DMA Canyon report from 2015?
I mean, if I'd known about it then, are you talking around the Cupriavis incident?
Yeah, right about then.
Yeah. Oh, well, I would have assumed that there was a systemic problem and done much more water testing to try and demonstrate that.
So there wasn't an awful lot of water testing being done in 2016, was there?
No, there wasn't.
Why was that?
I think it goes back to guidance and what was in place at the time. So there's obviously the Legionella guidance. There was a Pseudomonas guidance, which I've highlighted was different in Scotland than England. Nevertheless, we did start rolling that out at the time. And apart from specialist units like aseptic pharmacies or renal or hydropools who follow their own guidance, that was the testing that was done at the time in conjunction with available guidance.
So the production of a L8 risk assessment in January, February 2016 would have caused you to start testing water?
Oh, much more than that though. I mean, I think if I'd seen the content of that, I would have recommended a whole range of control measures. It wouldn't just be about the water testing.
What sort of control measures do you think you would have recommended?
Given the findings of that report and the recommendations of the report and the likelihood of systemic contamination, I would have suggested at that point a chlorine dioxide system, which is what I had queried a year or two before in the infection control doctors meeting. I had asked about water control on the site and I was told it's temperature and it will be fine for 10 years. And I asked at that meeting, do we at least have the capability of dosing with chlorine dioxide if we need to? So I was concerned further back for a hospital that size and all the specialist units within it that we should have had, a second, system in place and not just be relying on temperature control. So I would have asked for that had I known about the risk assessment at the time.
Right. Dr. Inkster, you've got rather ahead of my noting.
Sorry.
Now, the question is, had you, in the beginning of 2016, had available to you the DMA Canyon risk assessment, Legionella risk assessment of 2015, I think you said if I'd seen it, I would have recommended other controls. Now, can I just get what these controls would have been?
So I would have recommended a chlorine dioxide dosing system.
Sorry?
Chlorine dioxide.
Right.
I would have also put measures in the most vulnerable units. So by that I mean what we call augmented care units, which are defined in the Pseudomonas guidance. So these are things like critical care units, neonatal units, haematology units.
Right.
Other things, like basic infection control precautions, because if the water results are coming back with bacteria in them, you have to obviously target the routes of transmission as well. So I would be ensuring that the infection control practice was of a high standard to block those routes of transmission.
And when you say chlorine dioxide, is that dosing of the whole system?
Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Right. I'd like to move on, if possible, to the your appointment as lead ICD. So you explained in your statement, paragraph 460, and indeed paragraph 18, that you were appointed in April 2016 as lead ICD.
Yes.
Am I right in thinking that's the 100% of your job plan, or how was it divided up as a microbiology?
It wasn't at the time, so the lead ICD role was 2 sessions a week, which is 1 day a week. And then I had 3 sessions for sector ICD, so I moved from regional to cover the children's hospital at that point. So 5 sessions for infection control and 5 for microbiology.
So just if we were to go back to the document on the screen, actually, and go to the beginning of that document, which is, yes, we just look at the characters present. If we just focus on the doctors for a moment, you became lead, and so when you became lead, you had 5 sessions.
Yes.
And if we look at Dr. Peters and Dr. Balfour and Dr. Bagrade and Dr. Changes, just picking them out as it were at random, how many sessions on average would they have had each?
So in total that time, I think we had 18 sessions available. Dr. Bagrade, I know, was on 4. And then the remaining 9 would have been split between the others.
So you were the one with the most sessions?
Yes.
Right, if we take that off the screen, what I want to do is to pick up the issue of Ward 5C infectious diseases. So if we look at Bundle 14, Volume 1, page 88. So it's a letter on the 6th of May to you from a group of infectious diseases consultants. And now I appreciate that I want to make sure I'm talking about the right ward here. So if we go on to the next page, we see the start of the letter, which is Ward 5C. How does Ward 5D relate to this story, or is it just not involved?
I think they had patients on both wards at the time.
Right.
I think. I can't quite recall.
So what was missing? I mean, we're not going to go through this in detail, but what was missing in their minds, in their wards, in terms of physical facilities?
So they had come from the Brownlee Centre, which, as they described, was purpose-built. It had at least 4 negative pressure rooms for isolation of patients with airborne infection. Those were at one end of the ward, which meant that that area could be relatively contained from the rest of the ward. And importantly, there was distance between patients with airborne infection and the immunosuppressed patients that they would treat, patients with HIV. So that was the
And they'd be at the other end of the ward?
Yes.
Right.
And they had come from that purpose-built unit to a general ward. So there was no infectious diseases unit for them. What they had available to them were some of the isolation rooms in critical care, which were the PPVL rooms. And at the time of the supplement document on PPVL rooms, there was an exclusion for certain airborne infections, which is a bit vague, but that was the concern, is that they had come from a hospital with 4 negative rooms for airborne infection to one with a handful of rooms in a critical care area, that we weren't sure if those were suitable for infectious diseases.
So firstly, where was the critical care area?
It was on level 1.
So it's 4 levels down below the
Yes. So there was a challenge as well in terms of experienced staff and who was going to be nursing these patients, because I think at the time it might be falling to intensive care nurses who don't have the infectious disease expertise that those nurses had.
And if we just recap on the difference of the wards, a negative pressure ward room would effectively cause the air always to be going into the room.
Yes.
And what's the situation in one of the positive pressure ventilation lobby rooms from your point of view that's concerning?
Well, it was going back to the email from Peter Hoffman. So he was concerned about, is a room really neutral or not? There's always going to be leakage in one direction, depending on whether it's positive or negative to a degree. And that's a serious concern when you have an airborne infection like TB, chickenpox, measles, or respiratory virus, because then you're putting other patients in the unit at risk, but you're also putting, staff in the corridor at risk as well.
So if we can go to an S-bar, which I want to look at, which is Bundle 4, Document 10, page 49. And it's really just to sort of connect this together. This is your S-bar.
Yes.
Now, let's look at the chronology here. You become lead ICD in April. The consultants write to you on the 6th of May, and you do this SBAR in May. Am I right in seeing a connection between you arriving and them writing the letter?
That's what I felt at the time, yes.
And what do you think the connection is?
I was aware that they had previously raised concerns with my predecessor.
And so you, sorry, carry on.
I wondered whether they were taking the opportunity for, someone new coming into it might be able to support them in making changes.
So effectively, what are you recommending in this SBAR in May 16?
I'm basically recommending that we need negative pressure rooms on the site for the isolation of patients with airborne infections.
Were you aware of whether there was a clinical output specification produced for an infectious diseases ward for this hospital before it was built?
I don't believe so, because at the meeting myself and Christine Peters had the previous year.
This is the meeting where someone from Brookfield was present?
Yes, they were very surprised to learn, but also...
To learn what?
To learn that there was an infectious diseases unit on site. But also when I was discussing with the Director of Facilities about trying to get these rooms progressed, I was told that we got what we asked for.
Well, can we look at some emails, which I think includes some people in this exchange, which is on Bundle 14, Volume 1, page 101. This appears to be an email from Dr. from Dr. Armstrong on the previous page. If we go over the page, to page 102. Sorry, the previous page in terms of the email, on the 18th of May 2016. What's going on in this thread which you provided?
It's a thread that follows on from the SBAR that I've provided to them, so it's their response to that. It's discussion as to whether we need these negative pressure rooms or not. I felt there was challenge at the time from the Director of Facilities who...
So who's the Director of Facilities at this point?
Sorry, that's Mr. Loudon, who, and I think in one of the emails in this thread, is challenging me with regards to MERS and MDR-TB, saying that at the time they were not known about. And I point out to him that in fact...
That's page 101.
Yes.
So we see that were both MERS and MDR-TB known to the board when the design was signed off? I'd guess not, but is that true?
It's not just about MDR-TB, it's about all TB, if you can possibly put those patients in a negative pressure room. But the problem that we had in Glasgow was not just MDR-TB. We had a case of XDR-TB, which is extreme drug resistance TB. So he was inaccurate with that statement.
But MERS probably was a new thing back then.
MERS would have been a new thing, but the thing is there's always the risk of an emerging threat. I mean, we've learned that from the pandemic. That's always a risk. And my point was that in a busy acute hospital like the Queen Elizabeth, anyone can turn up at the front door in A&E with a new and emerging threat or MDR-TB, and we didn't have anywhere to put them.
It seems, is it the case that what ultimately happens is a protocol is produced to send these patients to a different hospital?
Yes, we had to divert them to other hospitals with facilities.
Is that not a prudent course of action?
Well, there's risk in doing so, because these are highly infectious patients, so there is risk in having these patients transported to the staff involved in the transfer. It's particularly complex for paediatric patients because there wasn't really anywhere for them to go, and there were anxieties about having young children in an adult setting, and there wasn't, the staff to go with these patients elsewhere in Scotland.
If we just, again, play hindsight, and go back to the point when the decision was made to move this unit into the hospital. Am I right in thinking that one of the reasons it came is because the critical care facilities were going to be here in the new hospital?
I believe so. It had been at Gartnavel for a long time with no critical care facility on site, but they did have a high dependency unit, so a level of support could have been provided to those patients. But my understanding is they didn't have that either.
Do you know what's ultimately happened to these two wards in terms of this provision of rooms?
Well, up until the point I left, they did not have any isolation rooms.
And they were transferring patients to other hospitals?
No, so they were using the refurbished rooms in the critical care.
And some of those are different?
Yes, so some of those are negative pressure rooms that we refurbed. Some of them are your positive pressure ventilated lobby rooms. But the preference would be to put an airborne infection in a negative pressure room.
What I'd like to do is to go to, take this off the screen, please. The realization that there might have been something different about the ventilation in the general wards. If we look at your statement on page, paragraph 359 on page 121, please. You discuss how you had been trying to establish the specification of the general hospital rooms in the hospital when you started as lead ICD. Should I see a connection between the realization that was in the eyes of the consultants there an issue with the ventilation in 5C and this desire from you to establish specification? How does that desire to establish specification come about?
I was informed by Christine Peters, who I believe at the time was working with the cystic fibrosis consultants. And I think she was discussing cases of Mycobacterium abscessus. And I think that's how it came to light that the air changes were reduced.
So you think she would have worked something out and spoken
Oh
to you?
yes, I'm sure she told me, yes.
And then do we see an email, which I'd like to ask you to look at, which is bundle 20, document 68, page 1495. Now, it's probably better if we can make this wider, thank you. So this appears to be an email from Mr. Parry to you on the 26th of May, 2016. And what is it that this is telling you that was news to you at the time?
So I had an awareness that the air changes were reduced, but in order to actually do anything with that and escalate it higher in the organisation in the form of an S-bar, I actually needed to establish the fact and see it for myself and get an understanding of what the design was and the decisions at the time. So I think the previous email I'm referring to needing something from him, I think I had to email him a couple of times, just so that I could get the full picture and put enough content in that S-bar.
And did you have the opportunity of reading the attached documents?
Yes, I did.
I've just realised I've not put that in the document list, but I want just to find that for you. Can we go to bundle 17, page 2859? Uh, 2859, please. 2859. Thank you. Now, am I right in thinking that until you got this email from Mr. Parry, you wouldn't have seen this before?
No.
What did you think when you read it?
Very surprised.
Why were you surprised?
Because I was aware of the SHTMO 301, which recommended 6 air changes for a general ward.
And do you think that this document, over 2 pages, provides a sufficient justification for not delivering 6 air changes an hour in general wards and single rooms?
No, I don't, no.
Why?
Because there's no patient risk assessment within it.
So what would that have involved?
What's the risk to the patients by undertaking the strategy that is essentially a derogation from SHTMO 301?
And within it, is there anything in terms of the sort of factual matrix that's considered this that's a little bit unusual?
Well, for me at the time, I didn't know what chilled beams were.
Right.
So that stood out to me. I hadn't come across chilled beams before.
Well, but you've been in a hospital with them for a year and a half.
Yeah. I hadn't associated them with a low air change rate.
So you presumably you'd seen them when you'd been looking at aspergillus in the ceiling voids?
No, I had, and I had one in my office, but I didn't understand that they were linked, that they were designed to reduce the air change rate.
Or could
in
it be
terms of
they're
energy
designed to work
efficiency.
with a lower air change rate?
Yeah, they were an energy efficiency.
So chill beams was novel. What about the temperature target in the penultimate paragraph on this page of 26 degrees? Where's that come from?
I'm not sure about that.
Is it anything that you've noticed before?
No.
Because I just wanted to ask you about something I've noticed, which is, if we go back to SHTMO 301, so that's bundle 16, page 483. We're there already. The top row, I think, is the general ward we're referring to. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it requires, how many air changes now are required for general wards?
6.
6. And what's the filter type?
It's a G4, so it's much lower grade than a HEPA filter.
Right. And then there's no requirement on any particular pressure gradient?
No.
No. So the first thing is to look at is the temperature range, which is 18 to 28. Now, I just wondered, what would be the consequences, or can you outtell me, but if you can't, please do. Please tell me you can't do this, of setting a lower maximum temperature in a ventilation system?
Do you mean less than 28?
Yeah, so it's 28 there. If we go back to the previous document and bundle 20, sorry, bundle 17, penultimate paragraph, the requirement is 26 degrees. Has anyone ever given you an explanation of why the target was 26 degrees?
No.
No. If we go back to bundle 16 again. So what would be the justification that you would expect to have seen to allow for a lower than 6 air change rate in a general ward? What would you wanted to see in terms of detail?
A risk assessment for the patients, but my concern is I wouldn't have done that if I'd been involved in that risk assessment. I wouldn't have accepted less than 6 air changes.
Have you ever found out who, in terms of the health board, did accept it?
No.
No. While we're here on the subject of assessing risk, obviously top row, general ward, you've just explained that in order to derogate from that air change rate, you would require some form of risk assessment. We discussed a few lines down at neutropenic patient ward, and you've discussed how the consensus in 2009 might have been that that only really was required for individual rooms. Now you're nodding again. What I understand is, why would some form of risk assessment not have been required to not apply the neutropenic patient ward standard to the whole ward back in 2009?
Do you mean the 4B?
Well, 4B, 2A, wherever there's neutropenic patients.
I think because the interpretation of the guidance is, I think it's vague. I think it's subject to misinterpretation, such that people might not realise they had to do a risk assessment. They didn't realise that they were derogating from anything.
Do you mean the people doing the general ward one or the people doing the neutropenic patient ward one?
The neutropenic patient one. But the general ward one, I think, is very clear. Standard 6 air changes per hour. So I would have expected a risk assessment with that. I think there was consideration in an email trail around the renal outpatient clinics. So in a low-risk setting, it might be acceptable in certain low-risk settings, but you would still expect to have a risk assessment in place for that decision.
Okay, if we can go to your S-bar now. It's bundle 4, document 11, page 52. This is probably the last thing we'll do before the lunch break. So you produced this S-bar in June 2016. I'm assuming this is because you've seen the Mr. Parry email and the documents we just looked at.
Yes.
Right. What are you trying to achieve by means of this S-bar?
So this for me is a means of communicating with senior staff within the hospital. So I would send this to the HAI executive lead and the facilities director and the infection control manager to alert them to this issue.
And what are the recommendations that you have?
So the recommendations are there. Now, this is slightly different in that when I discussed this with Ian Powry, trying to retrofit air changes would be extremely challenging in a hospital that size. It would be major disruption. The ductwork was not sized appropriately to enable that. There would be no contingency or anywhere to put patients. So instead of advising retrofits of an almost entire building, all I could do in this situation was to put what I would refer to as risk mitigation in place. And that was very much focused around aerosol generating procedures where you would want to have higher air changes for dilution. So it was about protecting staff in those rooms.
If we just go on to the next page, please. No, I'll go back again. I want to just check there wasn't anything beyond. The reason I did that is because so far, and please tell me if there's something I haven't found, this is the only document post Mr. Parry's email in which someone suggests mitigations or risk reductions for as a consequence of it being discovered that the air change rate was under 3.
So there should be information in infection control SOPs around these recommendations.
So that's where we should find them all.
So if you were to look at the SOPs, for example, influenza, respiratory, RSV, there should be in those SOPs a recommendation to have this 2-hour, what we call fallow time, to enable dilution of airborne contaminants.
Because one of the things, I suppose, the problem with, I mean, this may be a very unfair criticism of your paper, I think about 2 minutes more on this, and we'll come back to it after lunch, is it's very, very specific. So one requires doors to rooms to remain closed. Now that's quite a high level. Everybody has to follow that, don't they?
In the designated areas in the assessment.
Yeah. So will it be in every single SOP for all those wards that doors to rooms remain closed?
I would doubt it. I think this relates to education of the ward staff. So after I got the email from Mr. Powry, I arranged a meeting with individuals from infection control. So Dr. Peters, but also the 2 lead ICNs for the hospital, Lynn Pritchard and Pamela Janidis, to discuss these measures. So I'm not sure if the door closing did get into the SOPs, but the 2 hours.
No, because the thing that worries me about is I appreciate that if you're doing an aerosol generating procedure, you might read the SOP, or your manager might read the SOP if you're a nurse or another clinician. If you're just generally in the hospital as a member of staff, how do you know after this S-bar that doors to rooms should remain closed?
You don't, I mean, I think you're relying on staff generally who are undertaking AGPs to know to do that, but I accept that that's not reliable.
Because one of the things that occurs to me, and again, I'm happy to be corrected either by you or witnesses between now and next Thursday, the fact that there is only 2.3, 2 and a bit to 3 air changes an hour rather than 6 isn't widely acknowledged by the health board, is it, at this point?
Not at that point, no.
No. So people using the hospital and all patients, staff, they don't know that they have to do some things, do they? So you have to tell people there's a
Yes,
problem in order to get
absolutely.
them to mitigate the risk. Would you accept that?
Yes, I accept that.
The other thing is, as you've identified, this is about this SOP, this SBAR focuses on patient placement and the high risk areas and those sort of topics. Is there anything you feel that should have been done by other people higher up in the organisation to mitigate the risk for patients in general?
I mean, in terms of the building, it's difficult to know what could have been done, given the issues with the ductwork and air handling units.
Because
But
one
in
of
terms of, I suppose, rolling this out education-wise, then potentially yes.
one of the issues is that you have patients in 2A and 4B who are quite immunocompromised, and they might go elsewhere in the hospital for procedures.
Yes.
I don't get the impression that you've addressed this in the SBAR here.
No, I didn't.
No. Is that addressed in SOPs that we can go and find?
I'm not aware of any. No.
No. I think, well, this is probably quite a good point to stop for the lunch break. Thank you, Dr. Teresa.
Yes, Dr. Inkster, we'll take our lunch break, and if I could ask you to be back for 2 o'clock.
Okay.